friends, dear colleagues, welcome to another issue in the History in the Edge lectures. Today I have the pleasure and honor to introduce our History in the Edge veteran. He already held a lecture here, Ivan Sablin. Ivan Sablin works as a research fellow at our institution, also, Institute of Contemporary History in Ljubljana. And he, at the same time, coordinates the research project, The Aggressor, Self-Perception and External Perception of an Actor Between Nations, in the Department of History at the Heidelberg University, Germany. In between 2018 and 2023, he led the research group Entangled Parlamentarisms, Constitutional Practices in Russia, Ukraine, China, and Mongolia, 1905-2005, which was sponsored by the European Research Council at Heidelberg University. His research interests include the history of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, with special attention to Siberia and the Russian Far East, and global intellectual history. And last but not least, he's also interested in digital humanities, especially historical GIS or Geographic Information System. He's a very productive author. I will not mention all the articles in very important journals. Let me just mention his 3 books. First book, Governing Post-Imperial Siberia and Mongolia, 1911-1924, was issued by Routledge in 2016. The second book, The Rise and Fall of Russia's Far Eastern Republic, 1905-1922. It was also published by Routledge in 2018. And the last one, last but not least, Parliaments in the Late Russian Empire, Revolutionary Russia, and the Soviet Union, also published by Routledge this year, 2024. And this is the book that we will talk about. And I will not go further. I will now give the word to our guest and let him present his book.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction, Marco, and it's a pleasure to be here again, also to use history at the Edge as a launch pad for this new book. The book is available online, free of charge, so it's in full open access. I also will provide a library copy for those who would prefer reading on paper next time I'm in Ljubljana, because unfortunately I forgot to bring it this time. But it is available online completely for free. So this is a result of my engagement with conceptual and intellectual history of the word parliament and the institutions that were called that way. The big question is, of course, was there a parliament in Russian and Soviet history, let's say before 1991? If we look at material sources, here we have a medal from 1906, which celebrates the State Duma of the Russian Empire, which first convened that year as the first Russian parliament. So, I mean, archaeologists 200 years from now would probably say yes, right? Because this is written right here. If we are discussing it from normative liberal standpoint, it becomes a little bit more problematic. If we're defining parliament kind of as an ideal institution, it has to have several characteristics according to Pasi Ihalainen and his colleagues who worked on the conceptual history of parliament. So basically it has to be an institution of dissensus where different positions, different opinions clash, and the decision is worked out based on that. It has to be an institution which is representative. It has to be an institution which is sovereign within the political regime. It has to be an institution to which the government or the cabinet is answerable. And it has to be a deliberative institution. So it has to have enough time to discuss all these different conflicting points of view. In this regard, not so many institutions in the Russian and Soviet history can boast even having parts of these characteristics, but some of them are present, and my goal for this book was not to check basically if Russian and Soviet institutions fit this normative understanding of parliament. I mean, from the very beginning I could just, after brief reading could say no. Yeah, so what's the point? Well, the point for me was to look at why was the term parliament was used and why continuously institutions which were called parliaments appeared in Russian and Soviet context. And then, thanks to my cooperation with Egas Moniz Bandeira and other colleagues who work in other area studies, we discovered that parliament truly became a global institution at this time when it first appeared in the Russian Empire, and it did not necessarily take the liberal normative understanding as the starting point. So why create a parliament and what is the meaning of that? This is something that I want to talk about today. So if we're going to discuss in very broad strokes what institutions were seen as parliaments or were called parliaments from outside or from within in the Russian and Soviet context, there were quite a few. So the imperial parliament, which I already mentioned, the State Duma, and second chamber of that, the State Council. Then we have assemblies during the Russian Revolution of 1917, which were supposed to serve as parliaments. Most important here is the All-Russian Constituent Assembly, which assembled only for one day. It was dispersed by the Bolshevik-led authorities, but it was the first universally elected assembly in Russian history. One of the first universally elected assemblies in the world, so it's also quite important for global history. Then we have a brief period of 18 years when the Bolsheviks are trying to create a modern state which is explicitly anti-parliamentary or non-parliamentary. The funny thing is that during this whole time, these institutions, Congress of Soviets and the Central Executive Committee, which is substituting for the Congress, between the Congresses, they were called parliament, within and outside. Yeah, so I will talk about that more today. And then we have a return to this global idea of parliament with the introduction of the Supreme Soviet, which is called already in 1935, when the idea is just being presented to the Soviet public. It's already called Soviet Parliament. And kind of this return continued all the way until Perestroika, when an attempt was made to create a real Soviet parliament, right? Not a nominal institution. And this is the first time when kind of parliament is taken also at face value from normative kind of liberal standpoint, and an attempt is made to reform Supreme Soviet and make it into a permanently functioning Soviet parliament. Okay, so the word was used a lot, and these institutions were also analyzed against the backdrop of, let's say, the standard understanding of parliament is. I would say that if we are to discuss these institutions from the normative standpoint, then only the assemblies of the late empire and the revolution and perestroika can be seen as having elements of parliamentary institution. There was dissensus, there was deliberation. So these were places where different opinions indeed clashed and different political forces. So you can see also that if we are to analyze parliament statistically, they grew significantly between the early and late 20th century. In the Duma, in its first 4 and last 4 convocations, there were some 400 plus deputies, and then here we have 2,250 deputies at the Congress of People's Deputies of the USSR. So this is a huge institution. You can also note that visually the portrait of the leader is still there. I mean, here we have the symbolic leader, Lenin, and the statue also, I mean, the depiction also increased in size, right? So there is definite growth in things related to parliament. But jokes aside, these two institutions, the late imperial and the late Soviet, are quite similar, and I will go into more details about that, how they're similar. So my main argument, kind of boiled down to one slide, is that the State Duma, the revolutionary assemblies, and the perestroika parliaments were imperial parliaments. And by that I mean that these were the places or sites where particularistic, so different communities, which were defined through, let's say, ethnicity, religion, gender, class, region, and so on, came together, and where kind of these communities defined through difference became political communities too. And it was also a place where a composite political community, so a community pertaining to the whole empire, the whole of Russia, or the whole of the Soviet Union, was being produced. So an inclusionary and complex composite imperial nation. So a community which would include all these differences based on one principle or another. But I will talk about that on the example of the State Duma. And these assemblies, so the assemblies before 1917 and from 88 onwards, they were preeminently sites of bottom-up community building. And they manifested attempts to reconfigure or reassemble the imperial polity. So if we understand empire kind of as this complex social space, these assemblies were supposed to create new rules for behaving within these spaces, to reshape their hierarchies, to provide collective rights to different communities. And in that regard, they were supposed to ensure political representation. So this is very different from the normative liberal understanding of representative government, because it was not so much about individual rights. So it was, these assemblies were supposed to deal with groups. And then we have the same logic also in the Soviet case. There the groups are defined from, through class, but it's still in the same logic of collective rights. So here we have connection to corporatist ideas of 1920s, 1930s elsewhere in the world. And then if we are talking about the pre-perestroika Soviet assemblies, especially the Supreme Soviet, they also performed a similar function of community building, but it was done in a top-down matter. So it was not a place where there were any deliberative discussions or where different interests clashed. No, there were no discussions at all in the Supreme Soviet apart from one at the very first meeting, and it was about what time the meeting should end so that deputies can go to the theaters and museums. Yeah, before perestroika, there were no other dissenting votes, not a single dissenting vote. Every decision was adopted unanimously, apart from this very first meeting. But they were supposed to kind of create the sense of community, kind of create the Soviet nation, inclusionary nation, in a top-down matter, by, on the one hand, kind of bringing all these diverse groups together, and on the other hand, demonstrating and fostering their loyalty to the elites, to the party. But for all assemblies, from the State Duma until perestroika parliaments, it was this integrative function rather than any legislative function that made the Russian and Soviet assemblies special, and especially distinct from the normatively defined Western parliament. So the parliament was not about giving laws. In the Russian and Soviet cases, it was about creating a political community, for ensuring the integrity of the imperial space, for keeping all this economic and social complexity together. So I will provide you with examples and illustrations. There will be also a couple of funny things, but before we get to that, let's also deal with the more serious matters. That's the theoretical and methodological approaches that I used in this book. In most basic terms, I try to combine two fields, conceptual history and so-called new imperial history. So basically, I tried to trace how the concept of parliament was developed, defined, redefined in this complexity of the Russian and Soviet imperial space. So for the imperial side, the works of Jane Burbank and the team behind Imperiju journal, like Ilya Gerasimov and Alexander Semenov, were especially important for me because they were at the forefront of what we have in Russian and Eurasian studies, the so-called imperial turn. So instead of seeing the Soviet Union especially, but also the Russian Empire as a community dominated by the center, dominated also by ethnic Russians, they proposed to look at what these communities and political formations really were. For example, the Russian Empire didn't have a majority at all. In ethnic terms, Russians were a minority in the Russian Empire. In the Soviet Union, this centralist view prevented people from understanding its very collapse. How come that this centralist, Russia-dominated community, the state collapsed into 15 independent republics, right? So this was the launch of these developments, and a lot has been written there. I would say it's now mainstream in Russian and Eurasian studies, but the concept of parliament was not yet studied against this backdrop. So previous research on parliaments mainly concerned with this question that I asked in the very beginning: were the institutions in the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union real parliaments? And the answer would be no. So there was literature about the failed parliamentary experiment or failed modernization. So I'm not, of course, disagreeing with these people. I mean, it's quite easy to see that these institutions were not legislative assemblies for most of history, but this idea of bringing all this diversity together was key for them. So basically, they were supposed to translate what Jane Burbank called imperial rights regime, so to translate all this legal diversity where different groups are getting privileges and rights directly from the dynasty, from the crown, to translate it into a kind of horizontal political formation. So basically, the people behind these institutions and within them, they tried to replace the Tsar, the dynasty, with kind of a collective sovereign that would be represented in the parliament, but a sovereign not just for any particular ethno-national or regional group, but for the entirety of the imperial space. Just two more comments here on the theoretical and methodological works that were important for me. Again, another work by Jane Burbank, kind of coming from different tradition from legal history, is applicable for the entirety of the Soviet period. Law in the Soviet Union was relational. So, for example, I didn't find any single work about the Soviet parliament, about the Supreme Soviet, where the bourgeois or Western parliaments wouldn't be discussed. So Soviet law did not exist independently from this constant contrast in itself to Western parliaments. And if we take the Supreme Soviet, an institution which did not really assemble that often, I mean, once or twice a year, just for a couple of days, there wasn't much substance to be written about it. So most of these works of Soviet legal scholarship deal with the idea how it is better than Western institutions and deal with what is going wrong in the West. And this is quite important because this is also a source of criticism of the failed reform during perestroika. When there is an attempt to create a real parliament, it's also constantly compared to Western institutions, and then it's very quickly discussed as a failure because it fails to quickly, immediately transform into this something that was criticized until, let's say, 87, 88, and something that became celebrated after that. For the Soviet public, this was, of course, quite a surprise. How come, our institutions, which were so much better than Western institutions, are suddenly worse than them? So I read a letter to a major Soviet newspaper precisely with this question. Like, what's wrong, guys? I mean, you've been telling us for, decades that our institutions are the most advanced in the world, how come we need to adjust them to the Western kind of negative example? And the last point here that I was using in the book was the idea of structural adjustments and basically the expert of institutions. Why these Soviet institutions are also so important? Because they were exported to dozens of countries. Some countries were in direct dependency from the Soviet Union. For example, the first dependency was Mongolia, but others became dependent after the Second World War, let's say Czechoslovakia, Poland, for part of the time Albania, for just a couple of years Yugoslavia, and this dependency reflected in conceptual terms. So the institutions which were created in the Soviet Union were then recreated elsewhere. So for example, the first Yugoslav constitution created a parliament which was quite similar to the Supreme Soviet in terms of its internal structure. And then only after the Soviet Yugoslav split, the system was reformed. And then it was already seen as such by Soviet agents, right? So in case of Yugoslavia, I've been reading the transcripts of a meeting between Soviet ambassador and the leaders of the Yugoslav communists, where the Soviet ambassador would impose one article of the constitution or another, and then Kardelj would say, you know, that's a very good suggestion, but maybe we do it other way, right? So he was trying to get autonomy in the creation of the first Yugoslav constitution too. All right. Now, of course, for historians, the big question is what sources I used. I used mainly transcripts. That was my main source, and archival documents. These were the two main groups of sources. So in the transcripts, I was specifically looking for the discussions of parliament, for discussions of nation, people, or narod, citizenship. So basically, I was looking for the discussion of what this institution is about, and also for the markers of representation. And then in archival documents, I was looking at how these institutions functioned. This was especially relevant for the Soviet period, where the things that were said within the parliament and kind of the things that were said in internal documents about these institutions were radically different. And I also used a lot of images. So you will see some photographs. In the book, there are 60 images, posters, and photographs. I couldn't sneak more, but 60 is already quite a lot, so I had to negotiate there. And I'm also planning to slowly publish the remaining images online. Also, I used quite a lot of press, and part of the work was done here in Ljubljana when I was a visiting research fellow here, and I was reading newspapers when I was here. That's also quite interesting for these two transformative periods between the Russian Empire and the Soviet state, and then the perestroika time. So this is just an outline of what I was mentioning. I was also interested in what decision makers and their opponents thought about institutions and about the concept of parliament. Thanks to the Open Society archives in Budapest, I also managed to get my hands on a great collection of Soviet samizdat, self-published material, and see what Soviet dissidents thought about Soviet institutions and parliaments. Now, to give you an example from the sources, I mean, when I started working on it, I wasn't sure if parliament would be such an applicable term for the Soviet period, but then one of the earliest Soviet sources from 1920, I mean, archival sources in this regard, just hit the aim perfectly. So here we have Lenin editing a speech which is supposed to be given by another prominent Bolshevik leader, Grigory Zinoviev, in 1920. And Zinoviev, like many Soviet leaders after him, is raising this point that the Soviet institutions are dormant, sick, half dead, whatever you name it, and they have to be revived, reinvigorated, and kind of start to properly function as they're supposed to be. And like many others, Zinoviev is saying that, you know, in 1920, when the most important phase of the Russian Civil War is over, it is important to revive the activities of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee. Yeah, just quick reminder, even though it has the word executive, it's not an executive body. It's like kind of a parliament, right? It's been called parliament by New York Times. It's been called parliament within, and that's what Zinoviev also calls it. He says that, yeah, we didn't have the luxury of having a regularly functioning workers' and peasants' parliament during the Civil War, but we should have it now. And I really like straightforward reaction of Lenin, you know, the 3 question marks to the word parliament, and then he's saying the word is wrong. Precisely because Lenin, in his famous State and Revolution in late 1917, argued on several pages that the Soviet state will not be a parliamentary state, that the Soviet state will be built as a non-parliamentary modern kind of political organization. And yeah, we can see that in conceptual terms, Lenin failed there because Soviet institutions were called parliaments. And there, for example, the Congress of Soviets, which was devoted to Lenin's very death, was opened with the words, yeah, welcome to our parliament, right? Something that Lenin probably wouldn't want to see there. Now, I'll just want to provide you with some illustrations about my main argument and about some of the institutions. So for the first decade, or let's say 12 years, this building was central for the history of Russian and revolutionary parliamentarism. It's a classicist palace in St. Petersburg, still there now, which hosted the Imperial State Duma. And then it was also the supposed site of the All-Russian Constituent Assembly, also hosted a couple of important gatherings during the revolution. And then Soviet assemblies had at least one festive meeting here in 1927. So it was seen as continuity between kind of the revolutionary assemblies and the Soviet assemblies, even though they were not supposed to be called parliaments, right? If we're talking about the State Duma, kind of this idea of the imperial nature of parliament is reflected already in its structure. So we have here 2 ways how people organized in the State Duma, and I have the example of the second State Duma, but it was the same for all 4 convocations of the imperial parliament. We have the classic organization into parties. So we have this idea that a representative government should be organized according to political views of the voters, who then be represented by parties, kind of horizontal, homogeneous representation, that basically we are all the same citizens, we just have different viewpoints. And then you can see that, yeah, there were quite a few parties. At this particular convocation and the second Duma, the Constitutional Democrats, the Liberal Party was still quite important. And then the Labor Group, kind of not a party, but a conglomerate of socialist forces, was also quite important. But then parallel to that, you can see a different way of organization, and that's something that I get from Jane Burbank's idea of imperial rights regime. So people organize also according to different categories or special interests. And here we see factions which are built on ethnicity, on nationality. We have the Polish Circle. We have a faction which is built on religion, the Muslim faction. We have a faction which is built on religion and class, the Muslim Labor Group. We have also another Ukrainian faction as an ethno-national group, and then we have a regional faction, a group of Western peripheries, or a group which is then known as the group of Belarus, Lithuania, and Rus. And it's also run by Poles, right? So we have at least 2 different groups of Polish politicians here. Then we have socialist state, so coming from kind of pre-modernization Russian context, the Cossacks. Then we have a group of Siberian deputies who are also defining themselves politically, because there was not a single right-wing deputy elected from Siberia into any of their imperial parliaments. And then we have kind of this conglomerate of groups which foreground difference based on ethnicity and region, caucus of autonomists. Now, these were not complementary systems. They were overlapping each other. So it was possible to be a member of the Constitutional Democratic Party, of the Polish Kolo, of the caucus of autonomists. It was possible to be a member of the Cossack, Siberian faction, and let's say labor group. So you can imagine that would be a lot of meetings, right, during the working week of the parliament. So basically, this complexity on the one hand reflected in the parliament, the complexity of empire, but it also continued to produce the complexity. Let me give you an example. We have deputies coming from Central Asia who have a problem. They come with grievances. They have people coming from the European part of the empire as part of the settler program, and their land is taken, and some people settle there to engage in agriculture. So they have this grievance, they have this problem of people coming and taking their land. Now they come to the State Duma, and it turns out that people from other parts of the Russian Empire experience the same problem. And then, for example, the Polish and Ukrainian deputies, they already have an answer, a solution for that, and that solution would be autonomy, right? This is the most popular political slogan among kind of these diverse groups. Autonomy meaning that if we are represented in our particular region and have control of how land is distributed, then we won't have this problem. So basically, the Duma creates the slogans that are then being used in 1917. In 1905-1907 revolution, kind of this concept of autonomy is still in the western part of the empire. In 1917, pretty much the entirety of the Russian Empire is familiar with this concept, and then this is one of the reasons why the Soviet state becomes a federative state, right? In the summer of 1917, Lenin says we're creating a unitary state. We don't need any complexity. And then just a few months later, in January 1918, he is leading the government which is creating the Russian Socialist Federation, because this is kind of the language which is necessary for transforming this empire. Here is an illustration for the group of autonomists where you have Poles. In this group, you also have Estonian deputies. You also have kind of deputies representing different religious groups, Lutherans and Catholics. So it's a very, very complex and interesting political organization, and quite, let's say, a forge which produces post-revolutionary elites. So, for example, a lot of Estonian post-imperial politicians, they started their careers here in the Duma and in this group. Also, it wasn't just about difference. It wasn't just about, defending the rights of Cossacks or the rights of the Poles, but it was also about producing this collective imperial nation. So I'll just read this quote out from a historian. So I like to tell my students that's a good, career opportunity for historians to become politicians. And because this speech was one of the most important in the history of the State Duma overall, it was constantly attacked upon by the right-wing politicians. It was celebrated by liberal and left politicians. So Kareyev said in the First Duma, "They say Russia is for the Russians. I understand this, but I understand this only in the sense in which one could say Austria is for the Austrians. But if in this case the formula Russia is for the Russians means something different, if in this case it means only one part of the population, that is, if this formula in Austria sounded like this, Austria is for the Germans, then I would naturally protest against this with all the strength of my soul. Meanwhile, until now, we have definitely not yet got rid of the idea that the future Russia, which should realize the brotherhood of all peoples inhabiting it, will ostensibly be the Russia of the Russians alone. We are all equal here. We are representatives of the peoples inhabiting Russia. Among us, there are representatives of the Polish people, the Jewish people, the Tatar people, and many other peoples." And later on, kind of this discussion continued, and for example, if we are to take the position of Sadri Maksudi, who became quite prominent in Turkish politics after the collapse of the Russian Empire, he's defining Russian as a political category. So he is arguing against a right-wing deputy, and he stresses that Russian is a political category, and he, ethnically a Tatar, is as much Russian as anybody else represented in the Duma. But at the same time, he's also saying that in every state there are numerous nationalities, numerous traditions, and this diversity is quite okay in the production of this community. Of course, the difficult question was how to put this in practice, how to organize the political space, autonomy, federation, something else, how to organize linguistic space, what language would be used, and so on. But for the standardization of these ideas, the Imperial Duma and, by extension, revolutionary parliaments of 1917, they played central role. Of course, a major problem with the Russian Imperial Parliament was that women were not represented there. So even during the two revolutions, during the so-called years of reaction, the existence of Duma stimulated further political developments. And, for example, during the time of the Duma, the first All-Russian Women's Congress was held in St. Petersburg, and it united liberal and socialist women. Some of them, like Alexandra Kollontai, were only formally part of this Congress because they were persecuted by the police, so she couldn't be at the meetings. But it was quite important in the sense that some women at this Congress demanded representation in the existing institutions, and others, like Kollontai and other socialists, they demanded full reformation or revolutionary transformation of the system. But again, kind of the common ground was that women should have full political rights, including representation in parliament. At this time, socialists in the Russian Empire were also all pro-parliamentary. Kind of if we look from external perspectives, the State Duma was criticized abroad, but it was seen as a kind of move in the right step. So, you know, the underdeveloped, backward Russia is kind of making its first steps with the Duma. Since the first two convocations were so quickly dispersed by the imperial government, there were also caricatures on that this is something like a foreign toy which easily opens and closes and not necessarily applicable to Russia. So I discuss quite a lot in the book this idea for each of the periods that I study. Was there possibility to have a parliament in Russia, and was a parliament needed in Russia according to intellectuals? For the Soviet period, I discuss it also through emigre and dissident sources. Now, this building that I showed to you played a huge role as a symbol in the 1917 revolution. It was also supposed to become the site of the Constituent Assembly. Here we just have a lot of posters. Like I like to tell my students that if you saw videos and photos from the 1917 revolution, it may appear, you know, as black and white, but there was so much color, for example, in these original posters. So the election was partially free in the territories which were not controlled by the Bolshevik-led government. There was proper political competition, and since the Bolsheviks didn't win the elections, they dispersed the Constituent Assembly just after one meeting. We can see Lenin here with Alexander Kollontai, by the way, Lenin being visibly not amused by what's going on in the Constituent Assembly. Basically, the Bolsheviks proposed that it recognized the Soviet government. It didn't, so it was dispersed. Instead of it, an anti-parliamentary regime was to be created, and the Bolsheviks already within the Constituent Assembly said that parliamentary institutions are fictitious idols. They're not needed, right? What we're gonna build is something completely different, something built on Soviets, which kind of translate directly the real will of the majority of the population. And then the, let's say, 18 years of experimentation started in this regard. I already told you that discursively, the Soviet experiment of building an anti-parliamentary modern state failed. It was called parliament by the very leaders of this government. Only I think Lenin didn't call it parliament. And then Molotov, after Lenin's death, would be the person who would say that this shouldn't be called a parliament. Yeah, take a mental note of that. So Molotov was trying to keep Lenin's heritage and say that this is not a parliament, please don't call it that. And we don't need a parliament because we are building something much more advanced than a parliament. And then, in order to demonstrate this advancement, the Soviet assemblies from their early years of existence engaged in descriptive representation. So, for example, the representation of women was put forward. Why were Soviet assemblies better than Western assemblies? Because women were properly represented there. The Bolshevik party had an unofficial quota of roughly 20% for women in Soviet assemblies. Interestingly, this quota didn't change until perestroika. So in this regard, there was no progress in this. But it was constantly discussed within the Soviet institutions that unlike Western parliaments, we have proper representation of women. Same would be applied to, let's say, different nationalities. So during the later convocations of the Soviet parliament, the Supreme Soviet, every new convocation would start with the discussion how many nationalities they are. And then a female deputy would also get the speech and say how many women there are, how many young people there are, right? So this descriptive representation was exceptionally important, and it was also a way to show who was part of this Soviet political community, so what groups it consisted of. And then I mentioned to you that at least once in 1927, these people returned to the hall of the State Duma, and yeah, I got this question, like, did they see themselves as successors of the State Duma? Definitely. Because, for example, the newspaper reports about this meeting, they discuss how a Jewish member of the Central Executive Committee is sitting in the precise spot where one of the right-wingers, an anti-Semitic deputy in the Russian Empire, was sitting, and how funny it is, right? So in this regard, yeah, already during this anti-parliamentary period, they were seeing themselves as parliamentarians. Now, if you remember, Molotov was the defender of this idea that parliament should not be introduced in the Soviet state, and then Stalin made him give the speech about the introduction of parliaments in 1935. I don't know how he felt about that, but then he was supposed to basically prove that the Soviet state needs parliamentarism and it needs universal elections again, and then we will create in the republics kind of Soviet parliaments and all-union Soviet parliament. Since my previous lecture at the History of the Age precisely dealt with the Supreme Soviet and the functions, I will just give you a couple of brief illustrations of that. And it was also the part of the book which I worked on here in Ljubljana. But as I mentioned to you, there was just one discussion and dissenting vote in the Supreme Soviet, the institution which was created on this, how to put it, on the procedural issue. In propaganda terms, it was supposed to show the inclusiveness of the community. So, for example, an immigrant from the USA, Wayland Rudd, was pictured, and this picture was put in every possible publication about the Supreme Soviet. How, let's say, by contrast to the United States, especially southern states, African Americans, I mean, he's American, can vote, for example, in Supreme Soviet, because for the Supreme Soviet, everybody could vote. The problem was, of course, that for one seat, there was always one candidate for the elections in the Supreme Soviet. So this is an example of a bulletin, the electoral ballot, which, yeah, this is that's just it, right? So it's not like the first page, it's the only page, where you would have one candidate, and there the instructions leave in the ballot the last name of one, written in caps lock, of one candidate. And then if you leave it, that means you vote for this person. Obviously, we can discuss it during the Q&A session, kind of if this was planned from the beginning or not, but it was like this for the all Soviet elections until perestroika. And of course, the entire logic of, secret ballots changed, right? Because if you have multiple candidates, then you have to go into a booth to make sure nobody sees kind of which candidate you pick. If you have a ballot like this, the only reason for you to go to the booth is to cross out this candidate, right? Because you need to leave one. If you don't leave one, that means you're against all. If you're against all, you are against the candidates of the bloc of communists and non-party members. So in later elections, you wouldn't even have booths at some of the electoral locations. So this is an example of, let's say, a traveling voting station in the 70s. So here, this picture also illustrates the attempts to involve every Soviet citizen in the process of voting, because it was not so much about choosing, it was about affirmation. So under Stalin, the participation percentage and the percentage of people who voted for the Bolsheviks was smaller than during the later decades, because when you don't, have any competition, then you're expected to provide that everybody comes. So you would have pictures of people who just gave birth, and then they're already voting. I mean, not the children, because voting age was 18 at later stages, but the mothers, right? Or like this, right? So you are in the summer, taking care of your livestock in tundra, and then you're still supposed to vote. And I mean, why bother, with the booth if it's just one name and you're supposed to just look at it, There is one joke when a person comes to a Soviet polling station and starts reading bulletin, and then a person dressed in civics comes to him and is like, "What are you doing?" It's like, "I'm reading." And he said, "Don't you know that the ballot is secret?" So but better not read, just take it and put it. And then, of course, for party officials on site, this was a major challenge. They had to mobilize the people, go to every person living in the area, make sure they come to vote. So once the voting was done, there was also a major celebration among the members. I have it from a private collection from somebody whose ancestors worked in one of these committees, that it's major relief for the elections that they are done. So as I discussed this during my previous lecture at History on the Edge, it was supposed to kind of create this idea of unity through this ritualized portrayal of loyalty. You vote the same way, then in the Supreme Soviet, the deputies vote the same way, and this is the most common way of portraying deputies, right? So in the process of unanimous voting, right? So this is the most common way of portraying the deputies when they're together as a collective. When they're individuals, the most common way is to portray them doing their stuff. So basically, this is a way to illustrate who are members of the Soviet nation. So workers, collective farmers, also people coming from different ethnicities. Among the real functions of the Supreme Soviet and earlier institution was the collection of complaints from voters. So in a way, it was a representative institution, but kind of the deputies who were all handpicked by the party, they were appointed representatives for people to complain to. And this was quite important because during the later stages, the deputies of all levels collected hundreds of thousands of complaints on single matters. So for example, on healthcare in the 70s, I read one source about that, 178,000 or so complaints were gathered, and then these complaints were organized and studied within the party to make some small adjustments to policy. So in a way, it worked kind of as a representative institution, not just the way a parliament is supposed to work. And then for international propaganda, this idea that this is so different from the bourgeois parliament was constantly repeated, and then also it was exported, as I mentioned to you already in the beginning, throughout the dependent regimes of the Soviet Union. Then in 1955, the last and very important function for the Supreme Soviet appeared, and it involved constant foreign trips for Soviet deputies. So on one hand, it was a way to connect, for example, to post-colonial elites. So here we have Brezhnev, not yet as a party leader. At this time, he's not the leader of the party, Khrushchev is, but he's the chairman of the Soviet parliament, and he's traveling to India. The same year, he also went to Sudan. kind of in a way of connecting to new independent states, but he also had some power to sign agreements on cooperation, like he did in Sudan. And then for incoming parliamentary delegations, it was a way to show that the Soviet Union is a modern state and that it's an alternative partner compared to Western states. I read some very interesting reports about a Togo delegation where their major takeaway is that, yeah, we came to the Soviet Union, they showed us a mosque, which means that there is no direct religious persecution there. There is also no curfew. We didn't see people being shot on the streets. So that means that, you know, doing some business with the Soviet Union is possible. And then for some, of course, this was a touristy matter. So we have Soviet deputies meeting with some pop culture icons. We have also Western, let's say French parliamentarians visiting some ancient Russian churches. And then during the Cold War, also, this was one of the mechanisms for real politicians, let's say, to come to the Soviet Union and speak on important matters. So, for example, we see Joe Biden here leading Senate delegation to the Supreme Soviet. So I don't have much time left, but I will just briefly discuss how there was an attempt to, let's say, combine all these functions during perestroika and create, on the one hand, an imperial parliament where different groups would be represented and where kind of a better way of living together and sharing the political space of the Soviet Union be organized, as a Soviet parliament, a parliament which would collect all the complaints, go to different countries on these delegation visits, and a normative liberal parliament, a parliament which would read, discuss, and work out legislation. So this was an attempt by Gorbachev to create such an institution. Also, one of his closest allies at the time, Anatoly Lukyanov, who then headed the reformed Soviet parliament, they tried to combine all these functions together. It didn't work, right? Because people physically didn't have the time to collect thousands of complaints, which only increased in numbers with perestroika, because you have glasnost, the formal abolition of censorship. You have a lot of problems in all spheres of life, from economy to crime. So people have even more substance to complain about. Then the deputies need to properly discuss things with their foreign partners. It's not so much, about some brief secret meetings with the Americans and then just showing, churches to the Japanese. Now with the Japanese parliamentarians, they discuss the Kuril Islands, who they belong to, right? So you have to prepare, you have to travel, and then, of course, you have to read and you have to adopt laws, which, to the surprise of these people, turned out to be quite time-consuming, right? So there were debates within the Soviet institution of perestroika, like how do we manage to do that? Some proposed to abolish the entire complaint bureau thing, but it was rejected. So a lot of people just quit the Soviet parliament and went to the republics, and it was one of the reasons why the Soviet Union disintegrated into these republican unions, because it was much easier to do stuff within the republics. So Lukyanov still in 1991 tried to say that the Supreme Soviet is not a parliament, it's something different, something better, but at this time he was already one of the minorities. So the consensus in public politics at this time was that we just need to build something which was built in the West. So just reject the entirety of the Soviet experience as a deviation from that and just build something else. So some delegations continued. You can see that there is also the religious diversity element there. The future patriarch, for example, is visiting the Senate. And at the same time, kind of by the time of the collapse of the USSR, I told you that some people just quit themselves. Then some republics decided that they don't want to participate in the Soviet parliament at all. So this is how the last meeting where the dissolution of the USSR was adopted looked like. There were just a couple of delegations left in the upper chamber of the Supreme Soviet, and this is how the decision on the dissolution of the Soviet Union was formally adopted. I think I will stop here. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for this really interesting. It opens so many it opens so many questions. And does anyone has any questions, or should I ask the first one? Should I break the ice? I will try to break the ice. It's this, first I have a lot of questions, but this is idea that it's someone who is completely doesn't know anything about the procedures of laws. Didn't they have anything to do with adopting the law? And how was there? I was assuming that at least they had certain function that they should, I don't know, affirm the law or something. Was this just performative, or they were even discussing those laws?
So for the imperial parliament, for the first two convocations, it was still during revolution, the State Duma, and the Tsar simply didn't properly yield the right to adopt laws. So the Duma tried to adopt laws, but they were just rejected by the partly appointed upper chamber. So in that regard, the Duma was formally a legislative body, but just couldn't perform as one. The two laws which were adopted related, not two, just a couple more, but they were only related to immediate relief efforts to people who suffered from natural disasters. So on a very non-polemical topic. But the laws which were drafted in the Duma, they were about civil rights, about universal elections, all that was rejected. Third and fourth Duma, they were proper legislative bodies, but there was a change in the elections. So they were, for most times, dependent either on the cabinet or on the conservative circles. So they didn't adopt the laws which very prominent political forces tried to adopt. Again, on the equality, let's say, of women, or on introduction of self-government in parts of the Russian Empire. So in that regard, kind of only the third and fourth Duma and the Perestroika parliaments were properly legislative. And for the period between, so between, let's say, 1917 and 1988, 89, it was just performance. And in the Soviet institutions, the party leadership became their legislative authority already in 1918.
So it was official that the party leadership was adopting the law?
It was, let's say, not in the constitution, but this is how things were. And one legal scholar in 1918 proposed to write the party into the constitution, because everybody knows that the party is the legislative body. And then in the beginning, it was more or less keeping the semblance of some kind of discussions. So like until Stalinist period, there were some disagreements, but not necessarily in voting. And then after Stalin came into power, apart from this one disagreement about the time when the session ends, everything was brought to the party. Not a single comma could be edited within the Supreme Soviet or its standing body, and it has to be adopted within a specific amount of time. So not a single edit could be done by the Supreme Soviet, and not a single vote was there.
But they were at the end. It was undersigned, like the Soviet adopted.
Not necessarily the Supreme Soviet itself, because the Supreme Soviet, it assembled for just, let's say, 2 weeks a year. And then between the sessions, the standing body, the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, was there as a substitute. So a collective president, it was called sometimes. So it was this collective president which adopted the laws, right? So in this regard, even formally, the Supreme Soviet was not involved into the adoption of most legislation, because it just didn't have time. So it would adopt the budget, a couple of laws a year maybe, and then the rest would be just put out as the Presidium decrees.
Thank you. Questions, please?
I also have like 10 questions, but this was very, very interesting. Thank you. My question regards just some of the terms that you use so that I understand the presentation better. So when you talk about a normative I could understand if you meant a normative definition of a parliament or a norm creating parliament as the contrast. Which normative was it? Because in a way, there's a tension between that. Because I understand that the institutions that you presented don't produce norms, aren't responsible for legislating, basically. But there's a tension because the Western Parliament appears as a norm for the research. It's something that you're comparing to say it's not like that, it doesn't work like that. And it's very interesting and it's very revealing what you show, like how it actually was. And what's interesting though is that on the one hand, we don't have the Soviet or Russian imperial norms, what they said about themselves, like Parliament should be, or the Supreme Soviet should be this, or the Duma should be this, in contrast to what it actually was. We only know what it actually was, which is better, of course, but... And in the case of the Western Parliament, we only get what it says about itself. This is what we are, this is what we should be, but not how Western Parliament actually is. It would be very interesting if you would extend your research to Western parliaments that are convinced that they are an expression of this norm, because if you go, I don't know, to England, sure, it's a multi-party system, but if you go to certain constituencies, effectively only one party can be elected and has been elected for decades. So is it a multi-party system or isn't? It is, but actually no, because in reality it's always the same. So you could apply the same kind of reasoning, it would be, very interesting. But I was curious about this, and if I can add just one more, I don't understand when you say that, for instance, the fact that women are present in this body, that this is descriptive. That this is descriptive as opposed to what, right? There are no women in most Western parliaments at this point, if any. So, I don't know, that their presence there seems more than just descriptive. Even if the body itself doesn't. And maybe a third one, which is what do they do in the time between the sessions? Is it this thing with the complaints? Because very typically for the conception of a Western parliament is that it doesn't really matter what you do outside, and it matters what you do inside there. And it's very focused on that performance, which is also a performance. So what were their role in the rest of their time? Because then who they are, the fact that it's all these has a function, right?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the questions. I'll start from the end. So between the sessions, some of the people had real jobs. Some of the people were representatives of the party apparatus. So basically the representatives of the party apparatus, they would continue with like kind of state management, semi-officially, let's say, if they didn't have like a proper government job. Other people would just return to their factory or to their writing table, because there were a lot of like writers, celebrities in the parliament. But then the accumulation of complaints would be the main job as a deputy. And that would make this job very unattractive for celebrities. Because, for example, as a writer, you have a lot of work already, and then you have to deal with thousands of complaints. So it would be putting a lot of pressure. Like the deputies, very often, the prominent deputies, of course, very often didn't have much free time. Rank and file deputies, so let's say collective farmers and workers, they also got complaints, but they were probably seen as less efficient by people, so you would probably try to write to a celebrity who is member of the Supreme Soviet than to just another worker. But they also managed to push some things around. And then the topics would be everything from I'm living with 10 other people in my dormitory where we don't have a proper roof, like it's leaking, can you fix that? Or I need a job, or we need a church, even things like that after the Second World War. So it was this complaint bureau. If you're lucky, you also travel around the world. Yeah, so there were hundreds of delegations of the Supreme Soviet. Concerning descriptive representation, yeah, I would say that it's descriptive because it's not, I mean, descriptive as being not substantial. Because the women who were coming to the Soviet assemblies were handpicked by the party. So the party decided to who goes there. And I don't know a single female deputy who had any agency within the parliamentary system of the Soviet Union, because the speeches that they gave were written by predominantly male functionaries of the Communist Party Secretariat, Central Committee Secretariat, and they were written for any collective farmer, any tractor driver. So we know that from the diaries of the people who wrote these speeches, they just say, oh yeah, you know, this boring stuff again, I need to write a speech for a collective farmer, and then we'll just see who delivers it. And then you just given, you know, your only performance is you read it out. I mean, there could be some performance in this broker, kind of pusher thing, but I mean, yeah, you were just appointed to go there. So within the parliament, that's the difference with substantial representation. You're not elected, you don't actually do things that you decide that you want to do yourself. And this also dramatically changed during Perestroika when the quota was abolished. It also showed the very disadvantageous place of women in Soviet society, because in the free elections, the share of women dropped significantly, tremendously, to, I think, like 2 or 3% in some cases, right? So it's, only in the Perestroika parliament, women deputies had proper agency, when it's kind of was again perhaps a combination of descriptive, because, for example, some of them got to Perestroika parliament because the Committee of Soviet Women was represented there directly. So they got there because they were part of this committee. And then they could also make some substantial proposals, but that was only since 89, so between 89 and 91, right? So very brief period. Concerning the normative, yeah, I just use it when I discuss the definition. So I just discuss, I mean, scholarship on parliaments, conceptual history and institutional history deals only with Western examples. So they create a definition based on the example of Western parliaments, that there has to be, I mean, interestingly, legislative function is not even part of the definition. What is part is deliberation and representation. So it has to represent somebody and it has to deliberate. And then also the relations with the cabinet, so the formal things. And then, so in this regard, I wanted to extend and show that these bodies, which were called parliaments, had completely other functions. And I'm not kind of a path breaker here. Political scientists of the 70s started this. Stephen White, British political scientist, he was one of those who started kind of discussing state socialist legislatures precisely as these bodies for integrating the society. But why I think it's important for global history, it's because this was the example for many, many contexts, not, let's say, the UK Parliament, not the French National Assembly, but the Supreme Soviet was the example for those regimes which were completely dependent, let's say the People's Republics, but also for many, many post-colonial dictatorial regimes. Parliament became a global institution. Every modern state is supposed to have a parliament. I think there are almost no states now which don't have some form of parliament. I mean, United Arab Emirates had kind of a council for some time, Saudi Arabia too, but they are also catching up there. You have to have some kind of assembly. How do you model this assembly? Like the Supreme Soviet, right? So it's kind of becoming a feature of global modernity through this example.
An alternative norm, so...
Yeah, or an alternative, template, let's say. Because if we take the Soviet norms, I mean, they are very much like the Western norm. They're just saying they're doing everything better. More representative, better discussions, and so on. But this is not how the Supreme Soviet works. It's like hidden norm, let's say.
Questions? And I would like to ask you if you have considered this comparison with regarding Duma in imperial period with of course Austrian imperial parliament.
Mm-hmm.
And this idea that Russian doesn't mean in national sense, in ethnic sense, it's also, I suppose, it's a good comparison with Hungarian case, because there was very similar ideas of that sport. And what about Yugoslavia as a comparative model? How does work here? Because it's very, the Yugoslav system of self-management, Skupština or parliaments, who were then later in the later stage also delegates, and it was mostly about collective rights. We could also describe it as a kind of corporativist kind of turn. Although I don't think if those people would be happy, I would say, could say that. How do you feel about that? What do you think about this kind of those comparisons? Have you done any studies about that?
Yeah, thank you. Well, when I compared the State Duma to other imperial parliaments, I mainly relied on secondary sources, and with the Austrian parliament, there are quite a few similar debates surrounding the late empire, debates from the time, right, from the 1900s and 1910s. So people in Austro-Hungarian case, it's mainly social scholars, I mean the nascent social science, who are saying that empires can be modern and viable because precisely they have this experience of dealing with difference. So in this regard, the Habsburg intellectuals and the Russian intellectuals, they discuss in the same thing, how to properly create this modern imperial nation, which would not be defined through, let's say, language and one ethnicity, how it would unite kind of all how it would transform all imperial subjects into imperial citizens without this move to a nation state.
The idea of modernizing empire.
Yeah. And for Yugoslavia, I know the comparisons from the perspective of non-official Soviet authors, so dissidents and emigre authors who discussed the idea of self-government, kind of this self-organizational model of Yugoslavia. They were criticizing how it worked in practice in Yugoslavia, but they said that the principle itself is a principle of the future. And then some would say that the Yugoslav model is comparable to this non-parliamentary Soviet model, where you can also argue that workers came from kind of corporate background, they came from particular factories. So some people would also, during the Soviet period, discuss this in corporatist terms and would argue in favor of corporatism, saying that there are indeed these organic interests that can be represented by that. But
and it's also the nature of representation. Do you represent all the people that, like in Western Parliament, or you present just certain group and you're sent there by certain group?
The problem, of course, is also coming from the discussions of intellectuals, is that how do you prove that, let's say, you as an individual worker is represented by the collective? Because organic representation implies that, let's say, all Tatars think in a similar manner, all workers of this factory think in a similar manner. So it's like when you're represented as a group at the final federal level, then kind of this individuality is removed completely.
And that can be problematic. Any other questions? And thank you. And then we will continue our coffee. Since those who are not present here, you cannot smell the coffee. I always say that. We can. So we will now proceed to our coffee part of the lecture. And I would just like to remind you that our lecture series is not over until the summer break. We will have another lecture. It will be in Slovenian in 11th of June, the same hour. Bogo Župančić, architectural historian, will discuss and will have a lecture on the architecture of one of the leading modernist, or maybe the leading modernist architects of Slovenia, Edvard Ravnikar. It's the Ravnikar's year this year, so it's going to be a nice opportunity to learn more about him. Unfortunately, this lecture will be in Slovenia, and it's called Aktualnost arhitekture Edvarda Ravnikarja. Those who understand Slovenian are warmly welcome. And now I will just, I think, say goodbye and thank you for your attention.